Sound Speeds, and welcome back to the Sound Speeds podcast, part of the Geeks Rising podcast network. Now, I have two topics I'm going to discuss in this video, and the first one, I'm going to do my best to talk slower because I really don't want to lose you, because it's going to probably give you some insight about sound, the technical aspects of it, that you haven't considered before. Let's waste no more time and get right into it. For our purposes in this video, we're going to assume that you know absolutely nothing about sound or how it's recorded. So we're going to start at the very bare bones basics and work our way up. Sound is vibration. So a vibration like this. Now imagine it traveling in time. Whoa, that's making a wave. So imagine a center line. A wave goes through a crest, it goes through a trough, back to a center line. Your ears have the ability to detect 20 of those waves per second up to 20,000 of those waves per second. Now, a man named Hertz is the guy that came up with this. So we now call those cycles that we hear hertz. So 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz is what a human hearing can hear. But it was determined in the early days of experimenting with digital audio, pulse code modulation audio. If you really want to go down that rabbit hole and look it up, the engineers determined that if you wanted to accurately represent lossless sound to your ears, you needed to have no less than one sample per crest and per trough for the highest frequency that you're trying to accurately record. In the case of human hearing, that's 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So 20,000 hertz times 2, 40,000 hertz. That would need to be the very minimum. But if you start to get on the extremes, you start to lose a little bit of data. So they decided to give themselves a little bit of extra room there and call it 44.1K. Now, why did they come up with that number? Because in the world of recording things on videotape, which is how they recorded audio, PCM audio in the early days, it was determined that since the early days, pre-HD, was 525 lines of resolution on video at a rate, or basically a playback rate of 30 frames per second. But because of the scanning of a television, it didn't produce one entire frame at the same exact time. It was able to produce the first half. So it would alternate lines of resolution in fields. So the first field was lines 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and so forth, all the way down to the end. And then it would go back and recreate the even ones, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so forth. So it was actually doing field 1 in a 60th of a second. And the next 60th of a second, it was reproducing the second field. And that way the light would still be there and fading away as the electrons were replaced on your screen. So there's two fields at a frame rate technically of 2997, okay? But we're going to call it 30 frames per second. Now, in the world of NTSC, National Television Standards Committee, 525 lines of resolution, about 35 of those lines were used for things like time code and closed captioning. They weren't really usable. That leaves 490 lines. And when you take that and you basically were to determine that you wanted to have a sample, 44,100 samples per second comes directly from having 3 samples per line of resolution times the fields. So times 2 for field 1 and field 2. So 490 times 3 samples per line of resolution, that would be 44.1K. Now, this also was the same exact thing in the world of PAL, but their lines of resolution were 625, and their frame rate was at 25. But if you look at the usable the usable lines of resolution, multiply that by 25 or 50, because field 1 and field 2, same thing there, it came up also with 44.1K. I actually talk about this in another video if you'd like to check it out on sample rate. I'm not going to go any deeper on that. Check out that video if you're interested. Okay, so now we're able to accurately digitally record a sample and create 3 samples per second per line of resolution in each field. Okay, that sample had to be represented at a certain volume. So we have our sample rate, which is basically a sample taken in an interval of 1/40th or 1/44,100th of a second. Okay? Little chop up 1 second of waves, and you're able to create a sample of where that wave is volume-wise 44,100 times per second. So you're able to accurately, even the highest possible frequencies a human's able to speak, you're going to be able to detect it in a recording. But what about the volume? How are you able to accurately record that? Well, it was determined that if you take 16 bits and basically turn that into volume, where each bit represents basically 6.021, you don't need to know that number, call it basically 6 decibels per bit. So 16 bits per second, or 16 bits multiplied by 6 decibels is about 96 decibels of dynamic range. That's the area that humans are able to hear, down to the lowest volume and the highest volume of what's considered to be reasonable. Now, in the world of digital, if you go above 0 decibels, it becomes just static. It becomes, digital. It starts to clip. It starts to distort. It is no longer usable. So you have 96 decibels below that center, that point right there. Imagining you're in water, okay? 0 dB is the top, and you're able to go 96 feet or meters or however you want to call it underneath, and that's a representation. Okay? Think of it that way, in water, where the top is 0 dB. Now, this is digital that we're talking about. Okay? So each bit represents about 6 decibels, and we're able to sample this at 44,100 samples per second. And you're able to accurately record it on pneumatic 3/4-inch videotape in America or in the UK or wherever they're using PAL. Okay? So now we're able to determine how it's recorded. Now multiply this 16-bit depth times 44,100 sample rate. And then, because you have 2 ears, multiply it again by 2, and now you come up with a number of bits you need to accurately produce this. Needs to be 1,411,200 bits per second. Okay? That would be the bit rate, the rate per second. Okay? How many of these bits are needed per second to accurately record lossless audio to the human ear? Another way to word this is that's millions, right? So that's millions of bits. But if you were to go into kilobits, it would be 1,411.2 kilobits per second, or 1.4112 megabits per second. Okay? Now we're going to refer to this as kilobits now going forward. So we're going to also get rid of that last 200. We're going to basically just call that a scrap because, remember, we have a little bit of extra leeway in there, right? Okay, so 1,411 kilobits per second is the rate in order to produce lossless audio. Now, how does compressed audio fit into this, like MP3? Well, it's very simple, actually. You have to take your 1,411 kilobits per second and get rid of some of the bits in there to get it down to a smaller size, to compress it. When you compress it, you're squashing it in there, and so you're going to be combining some stuff. So things like, for example, harmonics maybe, or sounds that are the same frequency, but you can only hear one because it's being covered up by another, maybe because of volume, or maybe because, 2 sounds are creating the same exact frequency. It's basically there's algorithms that are in play that are going to get rid of certain information at a certain rate in order to accurately get it down to the compression that you're looking for. So originally, we were starting to play with compression like in the early days of Napster in the 90s for Generation X people and older that remember that. You remember that we were downloading audio usually at 128 kilobits per second. So that means that it was able to reduce down to about 1/8 in size, a little bit more. But then we started to say, well, we might want to actually not delete nearly as much. So we started to go up to maybe 160, 192. And then we finally landed on around 320. So we're only losing about, 3/4 of them and then change. So, but in order to do that, you can get rid of about 3/4 of the lossless wave and create something that is quite usable and listenable to the human ear. And we're going to buy it. We're going to believe that it's high quality, at even about 1/4 the size and about 1/4 the information. Okay. Now, this is the world of digital. We've talked a little bit in the past about analog, but let's go ahead and sidestep here because we did start off by talking about sound waves, right? Originally, we were recording in analog. That meant that the vibrations had to be accurately recorded. And in order to do this, we had to create a system where we could maybe record it, for example, onto tape. But on the low end, tape has a hiss to it. And then in order for you to create a level that was nice and loud, fully saturated, it would have to be above 0 dB. This is on dBu meters, not dBFS like digital. Decibel full scale, digital, basically, those are the two standards. dBFS is for digital, dBu is for analog. So on a dBu meter, 0 dB was usually considered to be the point of proper saturation. You would need to go louder than that if you wanted to accurately hear something. So you would have to bring up the level to maybe, +8, +10, something like that, decibels. Anything above 24 decibels would be, again, it'd be too saturated. It would distort at that point. But in the world of analog audio, you had only about 114 maximum decibels of dynamic range. So 114 decibels, that means that below 0 dB, you only have, because if you do the math, 114 minus that 24, you're going to be about 90 decibels below the center line, right? But in the world of digital, there is no noise. There is no tape hiss. So if you go below that 96 decibels in 16-bit audio, it's just going to fall off to complete dead quiet. But in the world of analog, if you start to lower the volume of something, it's going to start to go into the hiss of the recording. And depending on the quality of your recording, it might be that hiss is overwhelming at maybe 40 decibels below 0. So you might only have a workable dynamic range of 30 or 40 decibels if you recorded on tape. And the tape, like a Type 1 tape that you would listen in your car stereo, it would, as the audio faded out, it would start to become nothing but hiss because the medium itself couldn't produce a low enough noise floor to drive that hiss way down. You could actually hear how difficult it was to deal with analog dynamic range if you ever played with a record. You had a groove and you had a needle or a stylus that would go into that groove. And depending on the vibrations that were recorded basically into the grooves, because the grooves would basically be like this as it traveled in time. And it would create little waves that the stylus would be in. And because it was extremely sensitive to picking up and detecting the vibrations based on the pulsing and the waves that were, put into the grooves, it was able to determine, the stylus was able to pick up those vibrations and turn it back into sound. If you were to go from very, very big differences in the grooves, like big, huge like it would go from narrow to very wide and the stylus would fit in there, that would be a very loud sound. But if you wanted it to fade out, you would have to take the groove width, a little bit less and then less to the point where it was barely moving. But the stylus was very, very gentle and delicate at detecting vibrations, which is the reason why little particles of dust or something like that would fall into those grooves would always show up as little pops in the audio represented. So you'd have to keep a record very, very clean. So you can hear in the world of analog only maybe 30 or 40 in the average home recording, 30 or 40 decibels of dynamic range, while in the world of digital, you can hear 90 or more. Typically, when we record audio alone, we would record at 16 bits at 44.1K. But if we're going to record for video, you would want to have that sample rate, something that would be evenly divisible by frame, or 48,000 hertz, which is, again, that video that I mentioned before. So, in a nutshell, you have about 2 to 3 times the dynamic range in the world of digital than you had in analog audio. But yet we've gotten very, very critical of our audio in the digital era. Just like how, if we go back and look at a VHS tape, which was back in the 80s and 90s, it was considered to be what we had. And if we recorded off of television, it might have some artifacts in there. It might not have transmitted correctly to our television. Our bunny ears, rabbit ears may not have picked it up. Those are our antennas. Might not have picked up signals properly. And you only got about half the signal that they broadcast anyway at best. And by the time you recorded on VHS, it was about as good as it was going to get. And then when we went into DVD, that seemed like a world of difference in quality. Now you had digital audio and you had digital video. So no longer was it going to crinkle, and if you accidentally played the same part of a tape, like for example, let's just say one of your favorite movies was Fast Times at Ridgemont High. There was a certain scene in there with Phoebe Cates that was the most popular. It was considered, at least at one time, that there was a short period of about 10 to 15 seconds in that movie that was the most repeated part of home video ever detected, or at least up to that point. It was determined that was the most watched part of any videotape. So it would usually deteriorate in quality. People would fast forward and rewind. The tape would stretch just a little bit. It would start to crinkle a little bit as it was pulled across the head. And it was the same part of tape would start to get heated up, because it was the video head was playing on the same part of the tape over and over again. And it would start to heat up. It would start to be easier to stretch. And therefore, as it was not being pulled back into the cassette nearly as fast, it would sometimes crinkle or fold over on itself, thereby creating lines that traveled up the video or down the video. Okay? But again, the world of digital, with the creation of DVD, seemed really amazing at over 400 lines of resolution they always advertised. And all of a sudden, it was not going to have all these weird stretch and maybe audio blips, reestablishing of the control track. I'm not going to get into that. But basically, there was in the world of analog recording, you had to start with a pulse that was created at exactly the frame rate. And then the video signal and the audio signal was recorded at that pulse. So every new frame was created, and the information was put inside of those little pulses, and the machine would see where those pulses were, and it would determine that each one of those, with the information that passed behind those pulses, was a frame. So each frame was marked by one of those little pulses. But in the world of digital video, over 400 lines of resolution, which we could basically accurately call 480p for our purposes in the modern era, that's very low quality. And especially now that we're dealing with 4K, which is like twice as high and twice as wide as 1080p, we're talking extremely high quality. To give you an idea, if my screen resolution here is 4K, we're talking at like this little bitty tiny bit right here would be the resolution that I grew up with as a kid. DVD quality might be closer to this. Little bitty bit. The resolution of this screen in that little bitty bit is what we had blown up on a big screen, a big television. And by a big television, that was a big old 35-inch Trinitron or something like that. 35 inches was big back in the day. It certainly was when you were moving it in from a store. It was a very, very heavy beast. So, sound-wise, when we went digital, we were able to accurately Since all it is zeros and ones, we were able to accurately produce this sound very effectively. But in the world of analog, if we wanted to record it onto an analog audio or analog videotape, we could create digital sound properly that was going to be reproduced in a lossless quality based on those technical specs. So hopefully this is giving you some insight as to analog and digital sound and the difference between bit depth, which is the volume basically of your sound. And we're talking about just fixed point audio. We're not talking about floating point. As a matter of fact, if you want to get into floating point audio, 32-bit floating point, for example, check out that video right there. Bit depth is the decibels per sample. Sample rate is the number of samples per second. And then bit rate is the number of bits per second. So bit rate, bit depth, sample rate. There you go. For our second topic, I'm going to explain what a sound report is. It's a question I've received throughout the years on this channel periodically. So let's go ahead and discuss it. A sound report basically tells Post what the sound mixer tracked, giving information that's pertaining to the information that was recorded. To give you an idea of what I actually mean there, let's just say that the sound mixer says, okay, well, for simplicity's sake, we're going to say you have 8 channels of isolated audio, and then you're going to have your mix track. Okay? The sound mixer would create a sound report that says, I have 8 tracks of audio that are isolated tracks, and then one mix track that's track number 9, and that's the one that I'm mixing them together at. So Post will know to take your mix track and put it along with the video for the dailies. Okay? That mix track is also going to be transmitted out to the director and producers and whatnot at Video Village on the day. Those isolated tracks would be, for example, the boom would have its own separate track. Then maybe the one wireless microphone on talent. Then another wireless microphone on talent. Maybe a plant microphone. Those 4 tracks would be added into the mix track, but also recorded isolated. So what the sound mixer would do is they would say, mix track is going to be this channel 9. But for each of these other 4 channels, they might say, the sound mixer might say, boom is channel 1. And that microphone is a Sennheiser MKH50, or it is a Shep CMC 641 or a DPA 4017B, whatever the microphone is. They would list the microphone right there so that Post knows what microphone was used. And if they need to go back and try to do ADR or automated dialogue replacement to repair the audio and to replace the audio in post, basically re-record it, they would know what microphone is going to best match in their studio, because it's going to be a matching microphone. For the wireless channels, it's going to say, well, for this, it doesn't really matter what transmitter, because all transmitters are basically going to be high enough quality. But what they want to know is what the lav is. So, was it a Shure? Was it a DPA? Was it a Sanken? What lav it actually was, including the model name. So if it was a DPA 6060, if it was a Sanken COS 11, whatever it happens to be, you would need to list in the sound report what that was as well. Now, that is just per channel. What about as the mix is happening at the very, very end? What if there was a weird sound that suddenly came on in the middle of that take and you want to let Post know about that? Well, there in the sound report, you would also have a little part where broken down for each take, it would say notes, and you would write in there, air conditioner came on a minute in, or 2 minutes in, or air conditioner over this take, or for whatever reason, the boom operator was off axis with his microphone. And you might want to say boom was off axis. So that way Post will know not to use that. So that might be something that you list in your sound report for that particular take. Now, overall, before you submit this report at all, there's got to be the overall information that pertains to the recording. And that would be like, for example, the bit rate, the bit depth and the sample rate. And it would need to have the technical aspects mentioned that you recorded in. That you were recording in polyphonic broadcast WAV files, for example, and at a sample rate of 48,000 hertz, or 48 kilohertz at a bit depth of 24 or 32, whatever your project, and what Post is requiring of you. But whatever information you want to pass on to Post, you're going to put in that sound report. The actual folder itself, when you get the actual sound report, it's going to list the technical aspects that you recorded in. And then per tape, it's going to give you the not just a broken down of which track matches, was on this actor, this lav mic was on this actor. So Post is going to say, wait a minute, where's this actor's lav? Well, okay, it's right here. This track number 2. And what lav was it? If we need to replace it in Post, they're going to clip that lav onto the actor and they're going to boom them with the microphone that matches, and they're going to record ADR that way. But this information all comes from the sound report. Any information you need to give Post, you would want to give. Now, there's also, you can do a head slate at the very beginning if you would like to. Some mixers I know still do them, where you basically do as your very first track on your audio recording. You would basically call that a slate. So you'd say, hello there, my name is this, and the date is this, and we're recording 24-bit polyphonic broadcast WAV files at a sample rate of 48 kilohertz, and the time code, the frame rate is 23.976, whatever the information is pertaining to the project that they would need to know. They would need to know the frame rate in order to properly sync it up with camera. Because if camera happens to deviate from their frame rate of 23.976 and go just a 24, for example, hard 24, a true 24, then Post would need to know that you need to slow down or speed up one or the other, right? They would need to know in order to do a pull down or a pull up to match them. That is the information you would normally see in a sound report. The overall, format that it was recorded in. Then per each take, you would need to have notes that pertain to each take, if there are any that you want to add, issues or whatnot. And then you would need to list which actor, or, what the track is. Like if it's Jerry's lav, or if it's, Mike's lav or whatever, microphone lav. Anyway, and you would need to say what those model numbers are so that Post will know if they need to recreate the audio. Pertinent information like that is going to be included in the sound report. Now, who gets it? Well, it used to be that you would have to create copies of it, or even before that, you would have to have carbon copies and carbon paper of it. So you'd pull out and send off the carbon copies to people. So you'd have to press really hard on the sound report. This day and age, though, it's produced and sent out digitally via email. So sound report applications, including those built into recorders themselves, you can just have it be where you type in the emails of the email addresses of the people that need to receive the sound report. So producers, if you want to send it off to certain people in Post, you can just put their email addresses in there, and then once your sound report is closed for the day and you're done with your audio, you basically hit send, and it emails off the sound report so that way anybody who needs to get it will be able to get it and have it in their email. And they can look at it and determine what they need to. And so that way when they get the file, they could say, okay, well, here are the notes that we need to know about it. And here's all the information we need. Matching the take number, like, for example, scene 48, take 4, or scene 29, Charlie, take 3. Something like that. You would also list that information in the sound report. So whatever the take number was, you would need to also include that in the sound report. So anything that is particular to the take, anything that's particular that is pertaining to the setup, the scene, what tracks are being used, what microphones are on each track, who is wearing the lav. You might even also, if it's a boom, for example, if you wanted to, you could include a note in there as to what the boom was on. But chances are Post is going to figure out that the primary boom operator, is going to be on whoever's on camera. They're going to be able to figure it out real quick, because the very first thing they're going to do when they're looking for the audio is say, is it on the boom? Okay. If it is there, cool. If it's not there, go to the lav or go to a plant, and they'll go down the list that way. But as long as they have all the tracks right there in front of them and they have accurate information that tells them everything they need to know, they're going to be good. So hopefully this is giving you some insight as to how sound vibrations are recorded into digital files and even in the world of analog. I talked about that a bit too. And what sound reports are actually used for on a film set. So thank you for watching this episode of the Sound Speeds podcast. And I will see you in the next episode where I will bring you more knowledgeable things that you need to think about, know about, and as always, I will bring you sound advice. Have a question you'd like answered or want to add something? Be sure to write it in the comment section down below. You can also make a suggestion for future topics of discussion. Again, comment section down below, or you can email me at soundspeeds@yahoo.com. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on future sound advice.